know that practically every cell in your body has its own little power plant? It's called the mitochondria, and it's not just any power plant. It comes with its own wiring system, sort of like a tiny fuse box, making sure that the cell runs smoothly and doesn't short circuit. Now, the instruction manual for this cellular machinery, well, that comes from our genes. But if something goes wrong in that manual and the wiring misfires or the fuse box blows, then it can lead to all kinds of trouble: cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and even the natural process of aging itself. In fact, researchers have recently shown that one may be able to do mitochondrial transplants to help organs that are failing. And our guest today is Dr. Douglas Wallace. He knows this cellular power plant better than almost anyone. In fact, I'll say better than anyone. He's one of the pioneers of mitochondrial genetics, a field that he's been immersed in for nearly 4 decades. He's the director of the Center for Mitochondrial and Epigenomic Medicine at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And over the years, he's not only explored how this system works and how it sometimes doesn't work, but he's also used it to trace the incredible journey of how humans have spread out across the globe, all the way from our origins in Africa. So welcome, Dr. Wallace. It is so wonderful to see you. I am thrilled to have you here. I'm curious as to how you became interested in mitochondria, but first what I thought, maybe you can explain exactly what the mitochondria do and why they are so essential to life.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Howard. It's so great to see you again, and all the other visitors, including Rick Leach, which is fantastic. So we are very interested in this interesting life form that lives inside your cells. You have about 100 trillion cells, and within each cell, there's about 1,000 of these small bacteria. And those bacteria entered our cells about 2.5 billion years ago. And because of that unique relationship that was formed between what now is the nuclear cytosol and these bacteria, which we call mitochondria, we then had a system that was energetically powerful enough that it could then give rise to multicellular plants and animals, and that's why we're here. So in fact, these little bacteria that entered our cells 2.5 billion years ago are in fact the main reason for why you are here today. I like to say that the nuclear cytosol of the cell is a good way of locomoting mitochondria. And so the mitochondria are using our nucleus to get us around. And they're very happy about that.
So you're saying it's been around since the dawn of life itself, basically. It's 2.5 billion years. It's a pretty long time.
Well, in fact, the dawn of life is another billion or more years before that. But that dawn of life created these two forms of bacteria that came together. So one form of bacteria we call the archaeobacteria, and the other form of bacteria were the oxidative bacteria, the bacteria that made the mitochondria. And so it took another billion years for them to get acquainted and finally come together and make a marriage. But once that marriage occurred, all kinds of great things took off.
Well, we'd have a lot of problems if it took 1 billion years for people to meet each other, right?
We'd be sure that there would be fewer divorces.
That's probably true. So we eat all this food, but how does it actually turn into the usable energy that we have? And sort of how does mitochondria play into that whole thing?
Yeah, so the reason you eat food is to power your mitochondrial power plants, and the same is true for the reason you breathe. So in fact, the difference between being alive and dead is when someone stops breathing. So how could that be? So basically what we do is our food is made up of sugars, carbohydrates, fats, and also proteins. And the carbohydrates and the fats are actually the main fuels of our body. So they're made up of 2 kinds of atoms, carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms. And so what our body does is it takes the carbohydrates and fats, puts them into our cells, and then the cells break the carbon and the hydrogen apart. And then we burn the hydrogen with the oxygen that we breathe to make water. But what's really remarkable about that is in that process, the energy isn't just used to make an explosion because we'd all blow up. But what it really does is it harnesses that information to create a capacitor. So these little bacteria have, of course, an outer cell membrane, we call the mitochondrial intermembrane, and they then make a charge differential between the inside and the outside of that membrane. So they create a little capacitor. And what's really amazing is you have really about 10 to the 17th mitochondria sitting in your chair right now, Howard. And each of them has a membrane potential of about 0.2 volts. So the total energy sitting in your chair right now is the equivalent of a lightning bolt. And that's the energy that powers everything that you do. So when you stop breathing, of course, then you no longer are burning the hydrogen, that the capacitor collapses. And without the potential energy, then, of course, there's no energy to drive all the things you want to do. So it's a really pretty remarkable how food is converted into potential energy and then into what we call chemical energy by forming a molecule called ATP, which then powers all your movements and thinking and all those kinds of things.
So now you have the energy, now you have the cell working, and then let's say you exercise, you spend an hour on the treadmill, and why do you feel exhausted after that workout at the mitochondria level? What's actually happening in those little powerhouses?
Well, you've caught me, Howard. I don't spend that much time on the treadmill. But all that said, if you're exercising, if you're jogging, running, climbing, then you're burning the mitochondrially generated ATP. And the ATP is very important in making things happen chemically. So the way your muscles work, you have two kinds of fibers, what are called myosin and what are called actin. And they slide back and forth together to get your muscles to move. And it takes ATP energy from the mitochondria to slide them forward and then energy to release them to have them come apart. So when you're exercising, you're burning a lot of ATP. And actually, if you're maximally exercising, you're using all the ATP that your mitochondria can make. So you have an energy deficit afterwards. And so the other thing that happens is that as you need more and more energy, there's a secondary energy source that comes in. It's much less efficient, but it makes a little bit of ATP, but then it also makes a chemical called lactate. And lactate builds up and it makes your muscles burn. So you have to get rid of the lactate, and at the same time, it takes a while to build back up your energy charge of your ATP and what's we call phosphocreatine. And then after you've rested again, then you have the strength to begin to exercise again.
So what happens when the mitochondria just stop working properly, or someone's born with a problem with their mitochondria? Can your bodies bounce back from that, or is that not something that's going to happen so easily?
Unfortunately, the latter. As you're probably aware, there's now a great deal of interest in understanding the complex diseases that children and adults have where they have problems with their mitochondria. And some of these defects in the mitochondria can be very, very severe, and they can then give terrible childhood diseases. And because the mitochondrial energy is necessary for every cell in the body, you're going to get a multi-system disease. Now, that's an interesting problem because some organs rely on mitochondrial energy more than others. So the brain is 2% of your body weight, but uses 20% of all your mitochondrial energy. So you can imagine that a subtle change in mitochondrial function is going to give you problems with your thinking. So many of these children have then neurological problems. But then your muscle, of course, is also very important. So they have chronic fatigue. And then your heart, if it's put under high energy demand, it can fail too. So you get multi-system failure depending on the severity of the defect. Now, if you have a very mild defect, then it takes many years for the cumulative effect of aging, which we'll get to, and the inherited defect to make an energy deficiency enough to begin to give you the problems that you see with aging and age-related diseases, such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which you mentioned.
So, but everyone talks about stress these days, and everyone's concerned about what stress does to your body. Does chronic stress affect the mitochondria, and is there a way to actually, rev up the mitochondria?
Absolutely. So the idea of stress in the mitochondria is one of the really exciting areas right now in the field. So stress actually diminishes mitochondrial energy chronically. And so we have what's called integrated stress response, which then the body tries to compensate for the energy demand of the stress by changing the mitochondrial physiology. That's very good in the short term, but over long-term stress, that then can have serious consequences for the cell. And that's why people under chronic stress will have increasing problems. And that then will diminish their energy and then result in neuropsychiatric problems because, of course, those are the organ systems that are going to be the most affected: the brain, the heart, the muscle, and the kidney. So then what can we do about it? Well, there's a lot of excitement in two big areas. One, we could try and change the mitochondrial genes and then make them more effective, or we could actually develop drugs that would compensate for the defect. So let's go back to the genes. What's interesting about the mitochondria is, as originally a bacterium, but it shared some of its genes with the other bacterium that now makes the nucleus. So the mitochondria is assembled from genes in the nucleus, about 1 to 2,000, plus the mitochondrial DNA, which is actually the wiring diagram of the power plant. So the mitochondrial DNA codes for all the interesting proteins that allow the electrons and protons to move. But the nucleus is like the city manager. It then assembles the mitochondria, the power plant's parking lot and walls and so on. So what happens is, as you damage your mitochondrial DNA, each mitochondrion has a mitochondrial DNA. So you have hundreds of mitochondria, thousands of mitochondrial DNAs. So as they get damaged, more power plants start going offline. And over time, if you lose enough power plants, then you lose enough energy that you get the equivalent of a metropolitan brownout. And that then will first affect the brain, the heart, the muscle, the renal, the kidney systems. So you then get these age-related diseases because as we get older, we have more and more damage to our mitochondria. Whereas when my mother was 75 and I was much younger, she said, you know, what's strange about aging is I just don't have the energy I used to. Now that I'm 78, I agree with her completely, and that's why I don't use the treadmill. But I'm trying to reform, but I'm not doing a very good job.
It's always hard to get new habits. So basically what you're saying is as you age, this affects, that's why the aging process is tied to the mitochondria. You mentioned about the instruction book basically called the Mitochondrial DNA. So, and you've done some amazing work because you said that the mitochondrial DNA is basically passed down. That instruction book comes from the moms, and that you've been able to trace where people have come for the last, over 200,000 years. Tell me a little bit about that. I find that absolutely fascinating that through the mitochondrial DNA, you can tell us where on the planet people originated and how they moved.
Yeah. So what we showed in the late 1970s is that this piece of DNA, which is, as I said, the wiring diagram of the power plant, it's unique. It is inherited only from the mother. And the paternal mitochondrial DNA, which is in the sperm, are actually removed before they ever enter the egg. So the only way that the mitochondrial DNA can change is by changing mutations along the maternal lineages. So when we realized that in the late 70s, it became pretty clear that if we could analyze the mitochondrial DNA variation of indigenous people around the world, then we could compare how they were related to each other. So if I sequence your mitochondrial DNA, Howard, and mine, the number of nucleotide differences in the mitochondrial DNA would be proportional to the time we shared a common mother. And so by looking at all the different populations, we could calculate all their relationships to each other. And what we found is that all of the mitochondrial DNAs go back to a single mitochondrial DNA, which the Los Angeles Times once called mitochondrial Eve. And that mitochondrial DNAs in Africa radiated all the way up till present time. So there's a huge amount of mitochondrial variation in Africa. But about 65,000 years ago, only 2 mitochondrial DNAs found their way out of Africa, and they colonized all the rest of the world. And they then have become associated with specific populations and regions. And what turned out to be amazing about that is because the mitochondria regulates energy, but also regulates cell death, it regulates signaling molecules like calcium, and it also regulates our immune system, that by changing the mitochondrial DNA, our ancestors were able to adapt to all the different environments. And that's why they could migrate out of Africa and around the world. So those different variants allowed them to become enriched in particular areas, and that gave the signature for each individual population. So by simply looking at the mitochondrial DNA, we could simply reconstruct the entire migration and history of women specifically. Now, men, I think are very unhappy about that, but we did Y chromosome. It gives the same data, but they came later. I never could figure out how that happened, but my mother said it was perfectly reasonable.
Mom has some good advice and good wisdom out there.
She was a deep philosopher of life.
That's good. In science, you need some philosophy as well. You on that whole concept of people migrating, you've also shared with me something as fascinating as what you just mentioned, is the fact that people from regions where they had low calorie diets struggled if they ended up in a high calorie diet like the United States. And you said that this has to do with mitochondria, that basically that if you take someone from an area where their diet is different than our diet, they have a hard time adapting. So share a little bit about that as well.
Okay, so if you were an African resident for the last 200,000 years, of course, no one person lived that long, but people did, then they would adapt to that environment. So the environment is relatively low in high fat food and also is relatively hot. And the important thing in Africa is running away from lions. So if you're a woman and you want to reproduce, you need to run away from lions. And it's hot. You don't want to make a lot of heat. And you have relatively few calories. So what's your problem situation there? What you want to do is have very efficient mitochondria that can get the maximum amount of ATP, these energy molecules, out of the minimum amount of calories you eat. And therefore, you can run faster and on a lower calorie diet. But when people left Africa and they got into the Arctic, the advantage they had was that the lions froze to death. The problem was that they were going to freeze to death. So how come they didn't freeze to death? Well, the reason is that they kept changing their mitochondrial DNA so that their energy production became less efficient. Now, each calorie is a unit of heat. So if it takes 10 calories to make X number of ATP in Africa, then in the Arctic, you are going to be less efficient. So it might take 20 calories to make the same amount of ATP. So what's the advantage there? That means that you're going to have 10 calories more heat to resist cold. And so with those kinds of adaptations, the mitochondria allowed our ancestors to find viable homes all around the world by simply changing their mitochondrial DNA. And the same is true also for the immune system. The mitochondria regulates the immune system. And in some places, one kind of infectious disease is important, or another, it might be inflammatory diseases. These are all regulated by these mitochondrial changes along the maternal lineage.
So on the infectious diseases and the immune system, COVID-19, we've all experienced this. It's been an unbelievable challenge. How does mitochondria, I know you've been doing research on this, how does mitochondria come into play on that, and particularly the issues of long COVID where people say, I'm just fatigued, I'm tired, I don't have the energy anymore. So what happened to the mitochondria as a result of that?
Well, going back, Howard, to what my mother said, she just doesn't have the energy she used to. That's when she got to be 78. But these poor people with long COVID have that same symptom after they got infected by this virus. So how could that be? Well, we need to go back a little bit to how we use calories. So when we're an embryo, we need to build a lot of structures. So how do we build structures? We need these carbohydrates and fats as building blocks. So we want to use them to make more cells and to grow. But if the mitochondria burns the carbohydrates and fats to make only water and carbon dioxide, then there's no structures left to build things. So when we're embryos, we live in an anoxic or low oxygen environment because we're using most of our substrates to make our bodies. But once we become adults, we don't need to do that anymore. So then our mitochondria take over and burn most of our calories to make energy. But the virus wants to make virus. It doesn't want to make our energy. So what it does is it inhibits the mitochondria and drives the cell back to the embryonic state to make more substrates to make the virus. So what we've found is if we can, in fact, trick the cell to go back toward the mitochondrial form, we can inhibit the virus. But okay.
So no, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
But I was just going to make the last point then. So how come that relates to long COVID? So what the virus does is it inhibits the expression of these 1,000 to 2,000 nuclear genes so that we can't make more mitochondria. So the amazing thing we found is that it does that by changing something in the nucleus called the epigenome, which is what regulates nuclear gene expression. And it shuts down nuclear gene expression of the mitochondrial genes. But once it does that, it's very hard to return to the other state. So even though the virus is now gone, the shutdown of the nuclear genes for making mitochondrial energy is still there. And that's why we have long COVID and chronic fatigue.
So it hijacked the cell. It sort of hijacked the cell, the virus, and it took it for itself and decided it's going to use.
Absolutely.
Right. That's what it sort of did. Well, yeah.
And we think that's a much more general consideration than people had realized before, and think this might be applicable to understanding a lot of viral infections and maybe some of the new ways that we've been thinking about how to treat them.
So maybe chronic fatigue syndrome and chronic Lyme disease and all the others, same thing. On diseases, so those are infectious diseases, but what about sort of other types of diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and cancer? How does the mitochondria come into play there, and how are they linked together?
Thank you. Well, remember the point I made that 2% of your body weight uses 20% of all your energy. So subtle changes in mitochondrial function are going to give you neurological problems. And from our point of view in the Center for Mitochondrial and Epigenomic Medicine, we see this as a continuum. Very severe mitochondrial defects yield childhood neurological diseases. Milder ones would give you things like autism or schizophrenia. Even milder ones give you later onset diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, ALS. And these are all then due to defects in energetics of the neurons and the glia of the brain, which are such high energy demand tissues. So you're born with a particular mitochondrial genotype. Let's say you have a very severe nuclear mutation in a mitochondrial gene, then you're going to be very, very sick because you're going to have severe energy deficiency and you might get Lee syndrome and die. But if you only have a subtle change, let's say one of two chromosomal genes is mutated, let's say like SHANK3 as an autism gene, and one gene is mutated but the other is not, well, that energy deficiency is not as extreme. So you're going along perfectly along life, but because the mitochondria has also a kind of smoke that goes along with the furnace called oxygen radicals, these oxygen radicals are increased because the furnace is damaged. And you get more and more oxygen radical damage of the mitochondrial DNA. And the mitochondrial DNA is eroded faster than it does in a normal aging. So now your inherited defect, which wasn't enough to make you sick when you were young, plus the damage it made to the mitochondrial DNA, add together to give you an age-related degenerative disease. And these are the ones that affect the brain. So that's what we think is going on with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, and ALS.
Well, amazing, absolutely amazing. 10 days ago, I was up in Boston, at Boston Children's, because they had my cardiology program had a reunion. And when I was there, they raised the issue about heart failure in kids. And they said that one of the options is that they're looking at doing mitochondrial transplants. So maybe you can share a little bit about, because I read about this is relatively new and possibility. So can you share a little bit about, is there a way to help cells that are not working anymore in organs and take cells that are working and put them into those organs to help them?
That is what all of us are excited about and working on now. So the studies that you're referring to for the heart were originally pioneered by Jim McCauley in Boston Children's Hospital. And what he found is that when they were doing pediatric cardiac surgery, that sometimes they had poor outcomes. What he imagined is that maybe the mitochondria were damaged or stressed under those circumstances. So he isolated some mitochondria from the muscle of the child and then added them to the surgical site of the heart. And miraculously, the outcomes were greatly improved. Now, the reason for that is still not entirely clear because the number of mitochondria he was actually adding are far less than the number of mitochondria in the cardiomyocytes that make up the heart. Excuse me. However, this same kind of thing is being found by other people. For instance, Melanie Walker has been looking at adding mitochondria to the brains of stroke victims. So, and there's even some very exciting data where you can inject mitochondria into the bloodstream of cardiac arrest mouse models and get substantially better outcome. So I've been thinking, of course, a lot about that. And I think that we need to look at this problem in two different ways. One way is that the mitochondria might be helping physiologically. That is, they might be removing these oxygen radicals that are damaging the heart, or they may provide more energy locally. So that would be a transient thing that would affect the phenotype. And that, I think, is what Dr. McCulley and Dr. Walker and Lance Becker and others are seeing. But the other question is, could you actually change the mitochondrial DNA from a patient with mitochondrial DNA damage? Remember, we mentioned that if you had a very severe mitochondrial DNA mutation, like a mitochondrial mutation, as in the mitochondrial DNA, then you would have a maternally inherited disease. So how could we fix that? Well, what we'd like is to put in new mitochondria into the damaged mitochondrial cell and repair that. But that's going to be a little bit different because now we have to replace all the resident mitochondria with the new mitochondria. So that's going to take more mitochondria, a lot longer to get a genetic change. So there are really sort of two things that are going on: the treatment of acute disease with mitochondrial transfer, and then the attempt to cure mitochondrial DNA disease by mitochondrial DNA transfer. But both are very exciting right now.
So Boston Children's is part of Harvard. CHOP is part of the University of Pennsylvania. I picked those two universities because they have been targeted by the administration in Washington about this and about funding. So I'm wondering whether has your funding or has the funding for mitochondrial research, because we just spoke about heart disease in kids, you've spoken about neurological diseases, is the funding getting compromised as a result of what's happening with the cuts in NIH and all the other things? And how do you deal with that?
Well, the answer to the first question, which is very clear, emphatically yes. This is having quite devastating effects on the institutions that we rely on Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, Cornell, Columbia. They're losing the key funding that they need to maintain the infrastructure, which we call a research infrastructure. And without that infrastructure, you can't function. You need a library, you need electronic systems for communication, you need computers and so on. So that's what called indirect costs. And by cutting the indirect costs radically, they're basically taking out the infrastructure for all science. But at the same time, they're cutting specific kinds of grants. So we just had a grant that the study section gave a very good percentile. The grant had
a good number. Yeah,
it's a good number. We don't need to go into all the details. But one of the aspects of that grant was a collaborator who was here for a while, but now is working in Italy. So within days after getting this very, very fundable score, the administration said they're not going to be able to fund any people outside the United States from NIH grants. So basically, even though we had a successful grant to use mitochondria to look at cancer, we now can't do it because of an administrative decision. So these kinds of decisions that are occurring quite often now are making it difficult for people to plan how to continue their research.
Well, that's not going to make America healthy again, which is the whole plan. All right. So,
as many people have indicated, a number of critical long-term programs that not only involve the United States, but also global health and well-being are going to be compromised. Definitely.
So you turn to foundations for funding? I mean, what happens then? Where do you get the money to do this amazing research?
Wherever we can find it. It's like my mother and exercise, right? She had a treadmill. I don't own one, so that's about it.
Well, on that, I mean, there's so many more questions we could ask. What are the three takeaways today? What are three things that everyone should remember about mitochondria, the research, the diseases? Are the three things, and I'm going to write them down, the specific things that you think we should.
Number one. For the last half a millennium, Western medicine has emphasized anatomy. So if you have a problem in your head, you go to see the neurologist. That has a underlying corollary, and that is the assumption is there's a symptom in the head, there's something wrong that's specific to your head. But what I've shown you is you could have a systemic defect in energy that's preferentially going to give you a very bad headache. And so I think we've missed half of medicine by thinking primarily anatomically instead of thinking about energy. And without energy, you're not alive. So as I like to tell medical students, it's great that they studied the anatomy of a cadaver for a year and know every possible tiny little bit of the cadaver. But if the patient leaves their office like the cadaver, they made a big mistake because the patient's dead. So what we want to know, why is the patient dead? That's what I want to know. And that's about energy and mitochondria, not about anatomy. So that's point one. Point two, we've spent years thinking about information biology is digital, which it is. That's the nuclear chromosomes. But that's not all there is. There's other things like how different organelles interact with each other, and specifically how the mitochondria makes energy. And it makes energy using the mitochondrial DNA, which is never even considered when they look at the chromosomal genome. And so what we found is these mitochondrial DNAs that allowed our ancestors to adapt to all these amazing environments are really, really important in understanding all our common diseases, but they've been strongly overlooked in this area. And then finally, if we want to treat, we can't treat diseases by an organ-specific symptomatic approach. We need to understand the underlying physiology, which I think is mostly mitochondrial and mitochondrial relationship to the immune system, and address the underlying problem, not the tissue-specific symptom. So those are my 3 points, and I'm sticking to them.
I think they're excellent points, absolutely wonderful points. We're going to make sure everyone hears them and we put that out there. We reached the point now in the show where we turn to our most important guest, which is our subscribers out there. So Kat's going to tee up the questions. Just a quick point, I always make this point, is that the podcast is for informational purposes, not for in place of a doctor's visit. If you have a medical question, definitely talk to your doctor because they know your medical history the best. Kat, welcome back. Kat was on vacation, so she's back now. Kat, who's our first subscriber that we have that wants to ask a question?
Well, since it's my first day back, I really wanted to be the first to ask a question. So I'm just curious whether, if at all, toxins and pollution and processed foods sort of like impact the way that the mitochondrial function in folks.
Outstanding question. Absolutely. And in fact, another area where the role of the mitochondria and energetics has been badly overlooked. For example, why is it that when a person smokes, their risk of cardiovascular disease goes up so high? Well, many of the chemicals in smoke actually are inhibitors of mitochondrial energetics. And that then damages the mitochondrial ability to burn hydrogen. And the electrons from that then make more of these oxygen radicals. And the long-term exposure then of oxygen radicals damages the tissues of their brain and the heart and the kidney. And that's why smokers have such a very poor long-term health outcome. Another important toxin, which is used in agriculture, is called rotenone. It's used as a rodent poison. But people that are exposed chronically in agriculture to rotenone go on to develop Parkinson's disease. Why is that? Because rotenone inhibits the first enzyme of mitochondrial energy generating. So they've been chronically poisoning themselves. Many other chemicals that we have been told are innocuous are not so. And the reason may be that the original way of testing chemicals was to take, say, a model animal like a rat or a mouse and expose them for, say, 2 weeks and see if there was anything wrong. Well, if you want to give something an acute poison, in 2 weeks the mouse or rat is dead. But if you want to inhibit energy metabolism, then what happens is the animal just stops moving. It gets fatigued. But that's not an outcome variable. So many of the toxic chemicals from long-term exposure were not found because we don't do long-term exposure studies for toxicology. We do short-term acute ones. And so I think that we've really overlooked a wide range of potential issues that are important in our age-related disease process, which is, of course, becoming more and more acute.
Excellent. Thank you. And Kat, we're going to do a whole podcast on processed food and diet. So it'll be interesting to hear, perspectives from some of the other scientists about that as well. Kat, who else do we have up?
So I'm going to bring up James, who has a question, and remove myself.
Hi, James.
Hey,
Hi, Dr.
James.
Zucker.
How you doing?
Nice to meet you.
Good. You too.
My question is the body able to repair mitochondrial damage on its own, like, for instance, through lifestyle changes like exercising on a regular basis?
Outstanding question. Yeah. So several points to be made if Howard will tolerate it. First of all, if you exercise, then your body is making demands on your mitochondria. And the reason why athletes practice so hard is the more demand you put on your mitochondria, the more the mitochondria increase in number. So your ability to do aerobic exercise increases as you do more and more exercise. This bad news, which is what my mother tried to convince me I should worry about, is if you don't do those exercises, the cell gobbles up all those extra mitochondria and go right back to where you were. So I'm now at that point, but that's the sad part of the story. But anyway, now if, however, your mitochondrial DNA, which you remember is the wiring diagram of the power plant, if it becomes irreparably damaged, we don't have a very good way of fixing that. So what the cell does is it finds a sick mitochondria with its damaged mitochondrial DNA, and it gobbles it up by a process called mitophagy. So in Parkinson's disease, one of the major causes of Parkinson's disease is when you have a defect in this mitophagy, this ability to gobble up the damaged mitochondria. So the idea is that you take away the damaged mitochondria, and then the good ones make a new copy. But if you can't take away the bad ones, then the good ones can't make a new copy. And over time, your mitochondrial damage declines. So mitophagy is a very important aspect of that. Another thing that the mitochondria can do is it can increase the number of copies in a cell. So if you have a chronic mitochondrial disease, the body will try to compensate by making more and more mitochondrial DNAs, but it can only go up to a certain level. And so if your ailment is more severe than that, an energy deficiency, you hit like a ceiling, and that's when you begin to get symptoms. So there are lots of things going on here that the mitochondria, being an autonomous bacterium, it has ways of helping us be more successful, but it also has limited total capacity to do that. So can we do something about it? Well, there's some excitement about actually gene therapy of putting genes into the damaged nuclear encoded mitochondrial genes, or trying to use mitochondrial transfer to put in new mitochondrial DNAs into a cell. There's something called mitochondrial DNA editing, where we can try and change an altered base. But the problem is in aging and in these age-related diseases, every mitochondrial DNA has a different mutation. And so we don't have a way of changing all the mitochondrial DNAs. And so we're overwhelmed by this accumulated damage because we can't see it. It's like 1 in 1,000 of each change. So that's why the aging problem is still really difficult for us to intervene in, but maybe mitochondrial transplantation might be a way to approach that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
That is
great.
That is a great question and a wonderful answer. Kat, who else do we have up?
So I am going to ask this question for someone who is not on camera, but I believe this is related to the long COVID symptoms and SNS overactive and persistent immune activation. How does that sort of appear on blood tests is the question.
How does it appear on blood tests? Let's start first with the fatigue and then with the overactive immune system. No, let's do the opposite. Overactive immune system, we can see things in the blood called cytokines. They are small peptides that excited immune cells generate to help the body adjust to infection and inflammation. So people are seeing these accumulated cytokines in long COVID, and that's certainly been a very important subject that's been actively published on. The question is, why do we have those increased cytokines? So one idea is that the virus has damaged the immune system, which is certainly not a question. The question is, why did the virus damage the immune system? And the idea we have is that maybe the virus damages the mitochondria of the immune cells, and the mitochondria then signal the immune system to have these inflammatory responses. So that then means that it was the original inhibition of the mitochondria that then resulted in the response of the body to make inflammation. So then getting back to the mitochondrial DNA, what we're trying to do is to develop a very sensitive way of looking at mitochondrial DNA damage in blood cells and in other tissues. And so one way we're doing this is we've using a system called single molecule sequencing, where we can sequence a very long piece of DNA one at a time, millions of times in parallel. And so if all the mitochondrial DNAs in the body have a mutation, but every mitochondrial DNA has a different mutation, how do you quantify that? You have to look at each mitochondria one at a time. So by doing massively parallel sequencing of each mitochondrial DNA molecule and then toting up all the changes, we should be able to show that long COVID increases the somatic mutation rate. But we don't have the technology yet to do that.
I hope that answered our person's question from the chat.
Unless it just had added more questions.
Probably. Well, there always are. There always are.
My medical students often make that remark. Why did you bring him? It's just made it complicated.
Right. It seemed so simple before, but now
exactly. The guy was sick, obviously.
I know. That's what happens when you miss a day of school. And I bet your mom would have had a comment about that as well.
Undoubtedly. So, funny anecdote, when we found mitochondrial DNA was paternally inherited, I'm the third of 3 boys. And so I should have been a Karen. I was told I was Karen, it's just that I got named wrong. So anyway, so I thought, well, I can redeem myself by showing something really special about mothers, right? So I called my mother and I said, hey, Mom, I just made this interesting observation that might be relevant. She's a very big feminist at the time, that you're right, that women are the power of the society. And I know now why. And she said, well, why is that? And I said, well, we studied this DNA and it's inherited only from the mother, and its role is to make energy. It's the powerhouse of the cell. So aren't you happy? And there was silence. Now, as a child, there are 3 reasons why your mother could be silent. 1, she's really mad. 2, I guess 2, she's really mad. Anyway, so the silence gets longer and longer. You get more and more anxious, right? So finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I said, Mom, why haven't you responded? I thought you'd like this. And she said, well, you're telling me that my mitochondrial DNA was inherited by my children. I said, that's right. And the only way that my mitochondrial DNA could survive is if it went through my daughters. And I said, that's right. But you were supposed to be Karen and you murdered my mitochondrial DNA. More of maternal philosophy.
Yeah, well, there's something where you learn, as you get older and your parents give you good advice, right?
Try to be a Karen. Yes, I got that.
That's right. Excellent. I love that. That's like, write these things down. You tell your kids these exact same points that your mom has told you. Kat, do we have other questions, or is it time to wrap up?
I'm going to bring up our last question from
Great.
John, and he will go ahead and ask his question.
Hi, John.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Wallace. Thank you for joining. It was fascinating. So related to the maternal inheritance, does that mean that there are certain characteristics that would be expressed in us only derived from our mother, like in terms of energy level, let's say, or athleticism or what have you? Or is that apples and
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the mitochondrial DNA really is I like to call it the adaptive engine for biology. It changes all these subtle things that we take for granted, but are what make some people great athletes. Other people have unique other capacities, immune resistance to certain kinds of infections, asthma or not, predisposition to age-related diseases, the probability of getting schizophrenia or not. All of these things are tied up in part, not entirely, but in part to this little small piece of DNA that's found inside the bacteria in our cells. And that DNA is like the canary in the coal mine. It's sitting there and it's sensing the environment. And it's because of the energy of the cell that it's so sensitive to the environment. It's sensitive to the calories we eat and how we use them. It's sensitive to whether we exercise, which I don't. It's sensitive to whether we smoke, etc. And all of these things are inherited through the maternal lineage. Now, that is not to say that all mitochondrial function is maternally inherited, because there's 2,000 nuclear genes that are building the power plant. Now, of course, if you don't build the power plant doesn't work either. So you have both mutations in the nucleus that it can affect energy, but also specific maternally inherited defects that can give you problems. So there's a whole class of genetic diseases due to mutations in the mitochondrial DNA. And if you want to know about that, we have a website called Mitomap, mitomap.org, and we then record all of the known mitochondrial DNA mutations that result in disease. And so there are 104. This piece of DNA is only 16,000 base pairs. There's already 104 diseases that are proven and almost 1,000 that are supposed to be involved in this mitochondrial DNA. But those are only the bad ones. Of course, some of the mitochondrial changes are good, which is fortunate, and these are then good in certain contexts, like they would be less efficient in the Arctic, but it allows you to survive in the cold, but you would not be very good in Africa because you would overheat. Or you would be very good in Africa because you're very efficient, but you'd freeze to death in the Arctic. So one of the things that I used to be involved in the Olympic committee doping, and I said, I have a problem here because I don't think the Olympic Games are fair. And they said, well, why not? I said, well, I never saw an Eskimo win the 440. And it's for obvious reason that the Eskimo is not does not have a high aerobic exercise capacity because it has to survive in the cold. But I have an idea. What we could do is we could have Olympics both in Greece and on the North Pole. And each contestant would come 1 month in advance with just their gym bag. And then we would see that all the Eskimos would win the 440.
That's great. Let's do it. Can I ask you a related question? What do you suppose would have been the evolutionary advantage to inheriting the mitochondria from the maternal side?
Gosh, I love this guy. He needs to come back more often. Okay. Why would Mother Nature want to have mitochondrial DNA maternally inherited? Well, she thought a lot about it. And she said, what's the problem with the whole society? And it's men, obviously. So the easiest thing to do is get rid of men. Right? Now, why is that important? Because the mitochondrial DNA is a wiring diagram. And if you were an electrician, you know that you don't take a wiring diagram of one building and just mix the capacitors and the pieces with the wiring diagram of another building, because the whole thing would short out, right? So mitochondrial DNA is highly variable. Everyone on this call probably has a slightly different mitochondrial DNA. So if we started mixing matches, the capacitors and the electron wiring and the proton pumps of the different mitochondrial DNAs, the whole system would short out. So that occurs when we have recombination. That is when you have biparental inheritance. So to avoid that, you want each new mutation tested against the previous wiring diagram. If it's bad, unfortunately, you die out. But if it's good, the wiring diagram is preserved. And that's why these wiring diagrams are so powerful adaptive engines, because subtle changes allow you to increase your energetics to the appropriate environment without mixing them and shorting out the whole system. And so Mother Nature and my mother were right after all.
That's great. Well, so now I don't have a question. I just have a request, which is please write a book, because this would be, I was Googling you. I didn't see that you've written any books. I'm sure you've written a zillion papers and all that. But energy, that would be a big hit.
Okay. Well, if my mother was here, she would say caution, but maybe I'm freed at last to write a book.
Well, you could say, thank you, John. You could be caution, energy, right? It's like, and that would be a great book. That would be John, great idea. Great idea. Dr. Wallace, every time we speak, I learn more and more. It is just absolutely fascinating. Just for everyone to know, I looked up his articles and I've read through some, but I have to tell you, it is like a completely different language. If you just look it up, the charts and the tables, it'd be easier for me to learn, a rare language dialect in China or Chinese language than the charts of what you have there. So it's quite amazing. But thank you for taking us inside the cells and to explain to us how our bodies generate energy, what we need to do, what happens when it doesn't work, and when these energy boxes fail, and where we are. It is just amazing how mitochondria are responsible for chronic disease. They're responsible for everything, and it really would make sense just from a evolutionary standpoint. And it helps us stay vibrant and energetic and healthy. So I thank you. It's just wonderful, and thank you for being on the podcast today. And that's our show for today. But remember, if you are a Docology subscriber, you can join the show. You could just click on the link in the bio. So tune in next time, because the topic we cover may just save your life. Docology is a production of Hang Media. Our producer is Catherine Warren. Ronnie Selig is editorial advisor. Our creative director is Anna Richard. Janine Wilson of Wilson Media Group handles paid marketing. Our publicists are Leslie Ann Wade and Jerry Caracoli. Theme music was composed by Nick Kitts. Subscribe and join our community at docology.life. Until next time, move, wash your hands, and stay healthy.